The 4th of June 1942, Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The world was holding its breath as the Japanese Imperial Navy prepared to strike. The battle that was about to unfold would forever change the course of the Pacific War. On one side stood Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early naval successes, with an unwavering belief that his fleet would crush the last remnants of American resistance. On the other, Admiral Chester Nimitz, quietly confident in the strength of his forces, knowing that the fight for Midway could be the turning point the Allies desperately needed. The stakes couldn't be higher. Japan had already swept across the Pacific, capturing territories from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the Japanese believed victory was inevitable. But as Yamamoto surveyed his vast fleet, he couldn't have known that a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon, one that would strike faster than he could anticipate. In secret, the U.S. Navy's codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval code, revealing their intentions. Midway was the target, but the Japanese had no idea their plans were already known. The Americans were ready to fight, and the stage was set for a battle that would unfold with lightning speed. But as darkness fell on the 3rd of June, the battle for Midway was already taking shape. The American fleet, although outnumbered, had something Japan couldn't foresee: surprise. As the Japanese fleet moved closer to the atoll, the U.S. Navy prepared for a showdown that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The next morning, the storm of battle would come. As dawn broke on the 4th of June 1942, the sky was alive with anticipation. The Japanese fleet, consisting of 4 powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, advanced toward Midway, confident of their impending victory. Their plan was simple: launch a devastating airstrike to neutralize Midway's defenses, followed by an amphibious landing. The operation was designed to lure out and destroy the remaining American fleet, with the belief that the U.S. had only 2 aircraft carriers left. Enterprise and Hornet. The Yorktown was thought to be out of service. In Tokyo, Japan's top naval commanders were confident. Admiral Nagumo, in charge of the carrier force, had received the intelligence that the Americans would be caught off guard, just as they had been in Pearl Harbor. His optimism, however, was dangerously misplaced. While Japan had dominated the Pacific up until now, they underestimated the resilience of the American military. Yamamoto, who had spent time in the U.S. and understood its industrial power, had reservations about Japan's chances in a prolonged war, but even he couldn't foresee the depth of America's determination and resourcefulness. On the other side of the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz and his commanders knew the importance of this moment. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had intercepted the Japanese communications, revealing their plan to strike Midway. This critical intelligence, coupled with the urgency to protect the Pacific and avenge Pearl Harbor, shaped the American response. The American fleet, though smaller, had a crucial advantage. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the repaired Yorktown, were prepared for the fight, with their aircraft armed and ready for combat. What Japan had not considered was the speed and readiness with which the U.S. would react. Even the Yorktown, thought to be out of commission after the Battle of the Coral Sea, had been swiftly repaired in just 3 days. A testament to the battle, American ingenuity and resourcefulness. By 5:30 a.m., Japanese aircraft were launched, their engines roaring as they took to the skies, heading toward Midway. What Nagumo didn't realize was that the Americans were already in position, hidden just beyond the horizon. The element of surprise was about to turn the tide of the battle. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese bombers arrived over Midway, but their attack was met with fierce resistance. Marine Corps fighters scrambled into the air, though they were outgunned by the better-trained Japanese pilots. Despite their best efforts, the Marines' Brewster Buffalo fighters were quickly shot down, leaving the ground forces at Midway vulnerable to the oncoming onslaught. The bombs fell with devastating accuracy, tearing apart runways, fuel stores, and aircraft on the ground. Chaos erupted as soldiers and Marines scattered to find cover. Meanwhile, in the sky above, the Japanese carriers continued to launch waves of bombers and fighters, convinced that they were on the brink of victory. They couldn't have known that their greatest advantage, the element of surprise, was slipping away. Vice Admiral Nagumo, aboard the Akagi, still had one critical decision to make: whether to launch a second strike on Midway or hold his reserve aircraft in preparation for a possible American counterattack. This decision would be his undoing. By 7:25 a.m., American PBY Catalina flying boats had spotted the Japanese fleet and the news reached Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown. The Americans, now armed with precise intelligence, were ready to strike. Admiral Nimitz, with complete confidence in his forces, ordered an immediate attack. The first wave of American torpedo bombers, from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, launched their assault with determination. They flew low, directly into the guns of Japanese fighters, knowing the danger they faced. Their outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, lacking fighter escorts, were sitting ducks. One by one, the planes were shot down in flames. The sacrifice was immense, but these brave souls knew that their deaths might make a difference. The American torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown met the same fate. Yet, despite the carnage, their efforts were not in vain. By drawing the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude and disrupting the Japanese carrier operations, they had created the opening that would shift the battle. At 10:25 a.m., the real blow struck. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey and his dive bombers from the Enterprise, along with Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown, found their target, the Japanese fleet, in chaos. Their dive bombers descended from above, unopposed, as the Japanese carriers were vulnerable with their decks crowded and planes rearming. In minutes, the American dive bombers delivered devastating blows. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in flames, their decks exploding in the deafening roar of destruction. For Admiral Nagumo, it was a crushing realization. His fleet, once mighty and feared, was being torn apart in the blink of an eye. He had underestimated the American will to fight, and now, in a matter of moments, the tide of the war was shifting irrevocably in favor of the United States. The Japanese fleet was no longer a threat. The American counterattack had sealed their fate. By 12 p.m., the battle was effectively over. The Japanese carriers had been destroyed, their pilots killed, and their hopes for a quick victory in the Pacific shattered. The cost of this victory was high, and the toll on the Americans was also immense, but the victory at Midway had changed the course of the Pacific War forever. The wreckage of the battle lay heavy on both sides. By the end of the 4th of June 1942, Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were reduced to burning wrecks, their once proud decks now filled with the twisted remains of aircraft and crew. The Americans had inflicted a blow so devastating that Japan would never fully recover. Yet, for those who had survived the chaos, the battle had taken a heavy toll. On the American side, the victory was celebrated, but there was little joy in the aftermath. The U.S. Navy had lost over 100 aircraft and more than 300 sailors, including many from the brave torpedo squadrons who had fought so valiantly, despite knowing the odds were stacked against them. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his men had given everything for the cause, flying into the jaws of death without hesitation, knowing their sacrifice could make the difference. Meanwhile, aboard the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in disbelief as his fleet crumbled. In those fateful moments, he was unable to stop the unfolding disaster. As flames consumed his flagship, he was forced to give the order to abandon ship. The Japanese fleet had lost not just ships and planes, but irreplaceable pilots, the very men who had trained for years, honing their skills in battles across the Pacific. Their loss was catastrophic. Japan's once dominant air force, the elite pilots who had spearheaded early victories, was now decimated, unable to be replaced in time to stop the American advance. The aftermath of the battle reached Tokyo with staggering speed. The Japanese leadership, reeling from the loss of 4 carriers, tried to cover the extent of the defeat. Official reports issued to the public claimed a victory, asserting that Japan had sunk 2 American carriers while losing only one of its own. But behind closed doors, the mood in Japan's high command was grim. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Japan's strategy, understood the severity of the crossties, the blow. The loss of Midway was not just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic disaster. Yamamoto's deep concerns about Japan's industrial capabilities were now painfully evident. He had long feared that Japan could not sustain a prolonged war with the United States, and Midway proved him right. The Japanese had been overconfident, relying on a string of early victories and believing that they could break the will of the American people. But they had underestimated the American ability to recover and adapt. American industry was already gearing up to replace lost ships and aircraft at a rate Japan could not match. By the time the survivors of Midway returned to their respective nations, they carried with them the weight of a war that had shifted dramatically. The United States, now holding the strategic initiative in the Pacific, would move forward with an unrelenting counteroffensive, starting with Guadalcanal just 2 months later. Japan, by contrast, would be forced to retreat, its hopes of a swift victory dashed. Midway had marked the beginning of Japan's decline, a decline that would only accelerate as the war raged on. As the summer of 1942 came to a close, the world knew that the Pacific War had reached a crucial turning point. The Americans had proven that, despite the seemingly overwhelming odds, they could fight back and win. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted forever, and from that moment on, Japan would be forced onto the defensive, unable to regain the initiative. The victory at Midway was more than just a battle won. It marked the birth of a new era in the Pacific War. Japan's defeat was not just the loss of ships and planes, it was the loss of their strategic momentum, and with it, their hopes for a swift and decisive victory. What followed Midway was an unstoppable American advance across the Pacific, island by island, until Japan's doorstep was reached. For the survivors of Midway, the battle was one of both sacrifice and triumph. Veterans who had fought at Midway, like Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie and Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, would carry the weight of the battle with them for the rest of their lives. McCluskey, who led the American dive bombers in the decisive attack, reflected on the extraordinary nature of the victory. "We knew it was a turning point, but none of us could truly grasp just how much it would change the war. The survivors would become part of the greatest generation, forever linked to the legacy of Midway, a battle that altered the course of history." The strategic impact of the battle was far-reaching. By the 7th of June 1942, just days after the battle, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the significance of the victory. "Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged," he said, but he knew that the battle's true impact extended far beyond a mere act of vengeance. The U.S. Navy, with its now dominant carrier fleet, had the momentum needed to press forward and never look back. Meanwhile, Japan's fleet was crippled, and their strategic planning would never recover. The loss of their best pilots was irreplaceable, and as American industrial power began to churn out carriers, planes, and equipment, Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged war was called into question. Midway also left behind a psychological legacy that echoed through the Pacific theater. The battle exposed the flaws in Japanese strategy, their inflexibility, their overconfidence, and their failure to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions of modern naval warfare. Japan's high command had underestimated American resolve, their capacity to recover from setbacks, and their growing industrial might. Admiral Yamamoto, who had long warned that Japan was not prepared for a long war, now found himself fighting a retreating battle, his every move constrained by the loss of Japan's once vast fleet and the increasing power of American production. In the years following the battle, Midway's significance would be recognized worldwide as one of the most pivotal moments of World War II. It was a defining moment where the U.S. Navy demonstrated not only their strategic brilliance but also their ability to outthink and outfight a formidable enemy. In retrospective accounts, historians have noted that the battle was a military turning point, comparable to other great naval engagements in history, from Trafalgar to Jutland, because it didn't just change the course of a battle, but the course of an entire war. Today, the legacy of Midway remains alive in the memorials, the stories of veterans, and the ongoing recognition of those who fought. The battle is remembered in museums, war memorials, and military archives, where the sacrifices made by men and women from both the United States and Japan are honored. The echoes of Midway still resonate in the Pacific, where the tide of the war was turned in a few short hours, and with it, the fate of nations was sealed. As Admiral Nimitz famously remarked after the victory, the Japanese had lost their striking power, and the American forces had gained the initiative. Midway was the moment when the war in the Pacific was no longer a fight for survival, but a fight for the future of the world. The legacy of this battle reminds us that the outcome of wars is often determined not by the bravest generals or the fiercest soldiers, but by those who understand the full scope of the war, and in the case of Midway, the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy. For those who lived through it, Midway was not just a battle, it was the moment that defined the course of their lives and their place in history. It was a victory paid for with sacrifice, a lesson in the brutal realities of war, and a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who fought for freedom.